A few weeks after my Aunt Jean's 89th birthday, she said, I've got some money from investments that I don't want to put back into the market, so I think I'd like to prepay my funeral expenses. Jean did not have any children, and 9 years earlier, she had moved from Florida to Oregon to be close to my family and me. Well, I was delighted that she was willing to pre-plan her funeral, so I contacted a local funeral home and made an appointment. A few days later, I picked Jean up and took her to the appointment. Now, poor Angela, the funeral home's representative, had no idea about the kind of experience she was about to have with my fiercely independent, intensely private, and incredibly tight Aunt Jean. So, after completing a large stack of forms, each requiring Jean's signature and initial in numerous places, Angela turned on her iPad and she opened a page that featured floral arrangements, urns, guest registration booklets, funeral programs, and thank you notes. Well, when Jean saw the prices for the floral bouquets, she gasped and she shook her head and she said, well, that is just ridiculous. I do not need flowers. And then I said, well, Jean, I think flowers are nice. And, if you don't want to pay for them, why don't you pick out the kinds and the colors that you like and I'll take care of it. And then Jean said, but then you'd have to pay for them. I nodded and I said, well, yes, unless you die in May or September, because that's when our roses are the prettiest. I could always take those. Well, grumbling, she selected a pretty pink and purple bouquet and made me promise that I would take them home with me after the funeral, because she would not want such an expensive bouquet to go to waste. Well, about 45 minutes into the process, Jean ran out of patience. She had answered all of the basic questions about birth date, social security number, mother and father's names, and her husband's name and the date of his death, and she decided against the viewing of the body and agreed to have the service at the church. She picked Amazing Grace for music and told me I could figure out the rest as long as I didn't choose songs that would have people dancing in the aisles. So then, clutching her purse close to her chest, she stood up and said, I'm ready for lunch. Let's go. Angela shook her head and said, oh, we have a few more documents to complete. So Jean sat back down and scowled when Angela asked, Jean, did you work outside the home? Yes, I worked for the federal government in Washington, D.C. for 30 years. Angela said, what department? Jean frowned and said, nobody needs to know that. Angela patiently explained, well, this is for the death certificate, and they'll want to know what department you were in. And Jean said, intelligence. What branch? Jean snapped, why do they need to know that? Well, they just do. Army and Air Force. Angela said, how fascinating. What did you do? And Jean shot Angela a withering look, and I said, Angela, you could torture, and she won't tell you. You just might as well move on. Well, not amused, Jean stomped her foot and said, so how much longer is this going to take? And Angela said, just a few more questions, then I'll work up the estimate. And Jean said, I don't want an estimate. I want to write a check and get out of here. Okay, I'll hurry as much as I can, Angela said. And then she picked up another form and patiently asked, Jean, do you wear glasses? And Jean said, no, but I expect I might need them before I expire. Do you wear hearing aids? I do not, but I suppose I could need them too before it's all over. Wow, that's amazing, Angela said. Do you wear dentures? Jean said, ditto. I don't need them yet either. Now look, I didn't come with an expiration date, and I don't know what I'm going to need before I check out. So why don't you just figure out what has to be taken off or taken out when the time comes? And that was it. I couldn't control myself any longer. I started laughing, and Jean gave me the evil eye and then turned to Angela and once again said, how much longer is this going to take? Angela said, we're almost done. And Jean hissed, it only took 15 minutes to plan Frank's funeral after he died, and I don't know why this is taking so long. If you don't hurry up, I may die of old age before we get out of here. It's been several years, but I still cannot believe what happened next. Angela pulled out a catalog and said, Jean, sometimes people like to have a remembrance of someone who has died. How do you feel about jewelry? Jean waved her hand dismissively and said, well, I've taken care of that in my will. Then Angela said, "Oh, I'm not talking about the jewelry you have now. Sometimes people like to keep the remains of a loved one close to them." Jean just was staring at Angela, just confounded. And Angela continued, "Sometimes people like to have a small portion of the ashes in a separate urn, and sometimes they like to have the remains incorporated into a piece of jewelry like this locket." Jean jumped back like she had seen a ghost, and she said, "No!" And then Angela said, "Then you don't want your ashes divided? You wouldn't want to give some to Elaine and some to each of her three brothers?" And Jean said, "Absolutely not." Finally, Angela says, "Jean, this is my last question. If there's any money left over, do you want that money to go to your estate or do you want it to go to Elaine?" And at first she said, "Well, back to my estate." And then after a short pause, she said, "No, I've changed my mind. Give it to Elaine." Well, I clapped my hands and said, "Wonderful. I'll gather up my brothers and we'll all go have a drink." And Jean said, "That's the best idea you've had all day. Let's go." I helped her out to the car. I got her walker loaded into the trunk and we headed to her favorite restaurant. Jean ordered a sirloin steak and a pint of Black Butte Porter beer. During lunch, I said, "Well, now that we've got that handled, why don't we talk about your 90th birthday party?" And Jean said, "Well, I don't care what you do, as long as you don't have coffee, cake, and balloons in the dining room. I hate those affairs. And besides that, I'm not old enough to have a party. We can talk about it when I'm 95. So the server set Jean's beer on the table at 11:58, and Jean never drank before noon. So her eyes darted from her beer to her watch for the next 2 minutes. And finally, at the stroke of noon, I toasted her with my Diet Coke and I said, "Here's to your good health and long life." And a year later, we celebrated Jean's 90th birthday with a family dinner. A month after that, Jean suddenly got very, very sick. I drove her to the hospital where the ER doctors diagnosed her with pneumonia and heart failure. My husband, my children, and I were all with her when she died a few days later. We were allowed to have some quiet family time with her after she passed. And then later, the hospital called the funeral home to come for her body, and we all went home feeling sad but peaceful. Jean's husband had served in Patton's army in World War II. She had had his ashes interred at the National Cemetery in Florida near their home. Well, they had met in Washington, D.C., and that's where they had enjoyed some of their happiest and most productive years. So I was able to arrange to have both urns containing their ashes transported to Arlington National Cemetery in D.C., where they were interred side by side. I think it's important to acknowledge that making plans for incapacity and death isn't fun. But I do believe that it is one of the most generous gifts a person can give to their family. Jean's behavior that day was crankier than usual, but I didn't mind. I knew that death was an uncomfortable topic for her. I'm just grateful that she recognized that planning and paying for her own funeral would take a huge responsibility off of my shoulders. And for that, I will always be grateful.